Good morning from a frigid Colorado. It's a balmy 0 degrees this morning, and today I'm going to tell you a tale of three companies and the state of the semiconductor industry from a technological and production point of view. Now, if you go back to the world before 2017, the technology of the day was something called deep ultraviolet. Which was basically a way of producing microchips. And Intel, the American technological giant, was the world leader by pretty much any measure. And they had gotten a little cocky and they had gotten a little bit lazy. So they would design chips 2, 3, 4 models out, but would only produce the next one up. Because they were so far ahead of everybody else, they didn't feel the need to jump steps. So they would use DUV, and they would make a chip that was marginally better than the one before. And then at the end of the year, no one had caught up, so they'd do it again and again and again. And they did this for like 15 years. I mean, they're very good at what they do, but they could have pushed the technological envelope a lot more had they chosen to. In part, that was because of the nature of DUV technology. The problem with it is you have to kind of make micro adjustments and physically adjust the equipment for each type of chip, and you have to do that manually and physically. And so with every design, you had to do it all over. And with every machine in a fabrication facility, you would have to do it independently. So no new chips from different machines are going to be quite exactly alike, and it generated a relatively higher loss rate from the final semiconductors than what we have today, and so generated a little bit more waste. But again, they were the industry leader, no one was close. Well, they were always had their eye on the future, however, and so they invested in new technologies that would take them beyond DUV, one of which is EUV, extreme ultraviolet. And the company that developed that technology is ASML out of the Netherlands. And back in 2016, ASML thought this stuff was ready to go. So they're providing demonstrations for Intel, showing them how this technology is better. You can not only get more nodes on a chip and get to smaller and smaller nanometers, but it's all digital. So you kind of type in what you want to the machine over the course of a few days to a few weeks, and then the machine doesn't actually have to be physically manipulated in the way that DUV did. Now, what that would mean is you'd have a higher success rate and more efficiency, but back in 2016, Intel was like, I don't think this technology is quite right, and we're the industry leader, we're going to give it a few more years. Well, ASML, not very happy with that, marketed the technology to everybody else, and a company decided to take the plunge. That company is TSMC out of Taiwan. And when we get to 2017, TSMC suddenly hits the ball out of the park and proves that EUV is ready for mass application, and over the next couple of years very rapidly overtakes Intel because they have a shorter turnaround time for their chips, and they can make chips with smaller nanometer sections. It isn't until 2022 or 2023 that Intel finally makes its first extreme ultraviolet chip. So TSMC in Taiwan has been the industry leader now for several years. Now, we've had a kind of a reverse in the roles now. ASML, the Dutch, have another new technology called high numerical aperture, whose physics I'm not even going to pretend to understand, and they have marketed again, and this time Intel is the one that's behind, and they're kind of desperate and kind of hungry, and TSMC is the one that's resting on their laurels. So the first delivery of those new machines, the high-NA chips, went to Intel in the second week of January of this year. And Intel expects two things. Number one, they plan to overtake TSMC using the EUV technology in 2024, hoping to get down to 2 nanometers. Right now, the industry lead is at about 3 nanometers, and that's a TSMC product. And then next year, they hope to leapfrog even further, provided that these new high-NA machines work, which we'll find out pretty soon. Anyway, that's where we are right now. In terms of the overall geopolitics, it's pretty straightforward. Right now, 90% of all IHN chips are made by one company, TSMC, in one city in Taiwan. It's a high concentration. But if Intel, working with ASML, can pull this off, all of a sudden we will have facilities in the United States that are working on the higher-end stuff, with some of the first facilities that are going to be going online outside of Phoenix and Columbus, Ohio. So stay tuned, because the geography of these chips is about to evolve pretty significantly, if high-NA works. And if not, we're still stuck with Taiwan. It could be worse. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado. The big news over the weekend is that a Hong Kong court has ruled that China's largest property development group, Evergrande, is bankrupt and needs to be broken up. This is something that the Chinese government has spent a lot of effort on the last 2 years not happening because, well, let me give you a little backstory. So there's two big things that dominate the Chinese economy. The first is something I call hyper-financialization, the idea that the government both de facto confiscates the savings of the citizen population so it can only go into projects funded by Chinese state banks, as well as massively expanding the money supply to a tune of like almost triple what we have here in the United States in order to make sure that there is plenty of cash sloshing around in the system so that banks can loan anything in any amount at low terms to anyone at any time. Because if they can do that, they can expand, and hire. And people who have jobs don't go on long walks in large groups together. It's a public stability, political control approach to finance. It's not about profit. It's about throughput, because throughput requires a lot of bodies. Anyway, that's the goal. In that sort of situation, you get two things. Number one, you get companies like Evergrande who gorge on all this bottomless supply of debt to build, even if there's no demand. Second, you get a population who knows that their private savings is almost worthless because the Chinese government is forcing them to keep it in the state banks. And they want to put it into a hard asset that preferably the state can't control. And if they can't get their money out of the country, then the next best thing is a hard asset in the country, which typically is property. So you get people pooling their private savings in order to buy condos. And each condo is typically owned by a different consortium of private individuals, making untangling it. Also, you have somewhere probably in the vicinity of 1.5 billion units in the country that have never been lived in, never will be lived in. So you're talking about 100% overbuild conservatively. Some estimates say it's as high as 3 billion, which is just so far beyond stupid. Anyway, Evergrande going down means that their debts aren't going to be serviced anymore, and the physical assets they have are going to be parceled up, and foreign investors are going to be coming in and seeing what bits that they can get. None of these things are things that the Chinese Communist Party would normally allow to happen. So, there's a couple ways that this can go. None of them are good. Option number one is we follow a Western-style bankruptcy and restitution program where this system is broken up, and a lot of their assets are sold at pennies, maybe dimes on a dollar, and it just goes away. If that happens, we will have a very clear idea of just how much the oversupply in the market is, and you can count on private citizens being up in arms. Probably, the best estimate I've seen out of China is that 70% of total private savings is wrapped up in real estate, and most of these assets are worth no more than 10 cents on the dollar. So if you have a fire sale of the single largest player, which controls 1/6 of the market, holy shit, things are going to get real very, very, very quickly. Option number two is that the Chinese step in and abrogate the Hong Kong ruling. Now, legally, this cannot happen, but the Chinese Communist Party is not really big on legal details when it comes to Hong Kong in particular, and I have no doubt that they could stick their noses in that. If that happens, then Evergrande goes on some sort of state drip, and everything with the system just kind of limps on, with the understanding now that Hong Kong has no legal authority over its own holdings, which will start an exodus of what few international firms are still there. Regardless how this goes, don't expect anything in the market to get better. This is not like, say, the TARP program that the United States put into place back in 2008 at the bottom of the subprime crisis, which kind of froze the market and put a floor under things and allowed for reforms in economic growth to eventually heal the damage of the subprime crisis. No. This is a one-off decision that is not just holding back one rock from rolling down the hill. Evergrande may be the biggest player in this market, but it is by far not the only one who's been doing stupid things like this, building condos that have no demand or running it like a Ponzi scheme. Every development company in the country basically operates this way, and the second and third largest players in the industry are state-owned. So you can count on the Chinese government not using this as an opportunity to break with the old model and put into place something sustainable. And even if all of a sudden this place were run by a bunch of Austrian economists, it's too late. Housing demand, legitimate housing demand for houses that people actually live in, is dominated by people aged 20 to 45. people who are starting out. Well, 45 years ago, the Chinese government instituted the one-child policy. You combine that with the most rapid urbanization program in human history, and there are no longer enough people under age 45 to do anything that is consumption-led, including home buying. So there is no path out of this that follows any pattern that we have established in a market environment, which leads us to political and social outcomes where the market economics are just atrocious and getting worse by the day, with a government that is becoming ever more nervous about the state of the economy and the loyalty of its population. I don't want to say anything overly dramatic, as like this is where it all starts to fall apart, because we've had a lot of things like that go down in the last 18 months. But this cuts to the core of what enables the average citizen to actually support the government. And there's no way we move forward from this without a lot of side damage. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from snowy Colorado, where in the last 18 hours we've gotten 18 inches of snow, which means that this morning is a time for clearing and shoveling. But there is more to winter than shoveling and icicles. There is also the fun and games that comes with agriculture. In fact, winter is arguably the single biggest factor for how our world got to be in the shape it is more or less this century and last century. The issue is that when winter hits, everything stops, and you have a layer of moisture that then insulates the ground. This does two things. Number one, it preserves a little bit of moisture in there, and then we'll give a little bit back in the spring. But more importantly, the thicker the snow, the greater the insulation. And so you actually still have biological processes going on under the surface, even right there in the topsoil. Basically, you've got organic material that is decaying, or as farmers like to call it, the formation of free fertilizer. If you look at the map of the world's agricultural zones before roughly 1900, the pre-industrial era, you'll notice certain patterns. The American Midwest, to a degree the American Piedmont, Northern Europe, Central Eurasia, the Rio de la Plata Basin in South America, and the southeastern part of Australia and South Africa. Sorry, I forgot Northern China as well. What do these areas all have in common? It gets cold. You get some snow. And so you get that recharge system. They're temperate climates where the free fertilizer is kind of baked into the cake. If you go outside of those zones pre-1900, it's not that there's not agriculture, but by definition, it's almost not large scale. And most of the crops that feed most of humanity, so you're talking rice, soy, wheat, and corn, those four crops grow best in those conditions. You move out of those zones and you're talking different crops, things like sweet potatoes or yams. And it's not that you can't support a population with those things. It's that you can't support a large population with those things. So they're not nearly as amenable to row croppage. It's more subsistence farming as a rule. Now, that of course changed right around between 1900 and 1945 for some countries, and then between roughly 1990 and 1995 for the rest. What happened there was first the development and then the mass application of industrial-level agricultural inputs, things like fuels and fertilizers, which allowed you to plant more traditional crops in zones that normally weren't really great for it. In addition, those lower output crops per acre, if you started putting things like fertilizer, they would do a lot better. As a rule, the industrialization of agriculture had a bigger impact on marginal lands than it did on the prime lands. The prime lands still saw their output increase by 50% to 150%, but it's the marginal lands that saw a tripling, quadrupling, or even more. Now, something to keep in mind with all those secondary lands. If you're talking about, say, a steppe where it's just dry, with agriculture, nothing really happens. If you're talking about the tropics, yes, you have a riot of growth, but the nutrients are consumed by that growth as soon as the growth rots. So if you clear the jungle and the rainforest, the soil that's left behind is almost nutrient non-existent. And without those industrial level inputs, you really can't grow crops at scale in these zones. Now, because of industrialization of agriculture, we haven't simply seen the part of the world that humans cultivate expand by a factor of 3, we've seen the population expand by a factor of 3 as well. My concern is that we're entering an era where the supply chains that allow those industrial inputs to function, to exist, are going to break down. And for countries like China or Brazil, who import the vast majority of those inputs, that means the ability to sustain post-1900 levels of population are going to be hugely hit. In the case of Brazil, they still have portions of the country that are still temperate. It's not like they're going to starve, but they're no longer going to be a massive agricultural exporter to places like Brazil. So, for those of you who live in a place where you don't have snow, yes, you get more time on the beach and you don't have to shovel. But it also means the security of your food supply is decided by people in different climate zones with supply chains that are a continent away that you have no ability to protect or even influence. And the world we're going into, that's going to get a little rough. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. It is the 29th of January, and the news today is that in a drone attack, an Iranian militia operating near the border of Jordan and Syria managed to get a drone into an American base and kill 3 people in the vicinity of one of the barracks. These are the first deaths of American military personnel since the Iranians started pushing groups like the Houthis to attack Americans and international commerce in a large volume, and it's probably going to merit a response. Something to keep in mind is when the United States a couple weeks ago decided to start taking military action against the Houthis in Yemen, it wasn't because these Iranian-backed groups were attacking commerce in general. It's because they fired an anti-ship missile at a U.S. military vessel, and that's what started it all off. So working from that same logic, now that some Americans have actually died, you can expect the Biden administration to strike back. The question is how? There's kind of 3 things to consider. None of the options are great. Option number 1, you do a semi-proportionate, because the Americans always believe in overkill, assault against the militias that Iran backs either in the area in question or somewhere in the broader Middle East. The problem with this is it doesn't solve the problem. The people who are doing the attacks aren't Iranian. They're just using Iranian equipment and sometimes a little bit of Iranian intel. And even if you were to wipe them all out, they come from sectarian groups who are opposed to their local geopolitical orders. And so they tend to oppose Sunni groups who tend to be in the majority, especially in places like Jordan, or in the case of Iraq, where you have a pseudo-democracy. And in these cases, even if you were to take them all out, you just have an aggrieved minority that would, again, push people in that the Iranians would recruit. So it might make things calm down for a few weeks to months, but it's certainly not any sort of lasting solution that's going to change the logic in Tehran at all. The second option is to strike military assets in Iran proper. The idea is you go after the personnel that are making these decisions. The problem here is that there's a lot of them. Iran isn't like most strongman autocracies. You've got a ruling elite of the religious class, the mullahs, who's over 10,000 people. And even if you were to somehow magically carry out an assassination program and within 24 hours kill the top 1,000 of them, I mean, sure, they'd have some reshuffling, but it actually wouldn't disrupt the regime in any meaningful way. In addition, Iran is a series of mountains. It's basically a fortress. And if you wanted to go in there and knock the government out, you would need a force significantly larger than what the United States pushed into Iraq, which is ultimately a flat and somewhat desert community. And that means you're going over mountain range and mountain range and mountain range. So the distances are far. The logistics would be hard. The geography plays to the defender's strength. And then even if you were successful, well, then what? Are you going to stick around and try to reconstruct Iran in the way that we did Iraq? I think the U.S. learned that that's not an easy thing to do. So, and again, this wouldn't change any of the logic in Iran about what they're doing in the broader region. If anything, it would intensify it. That leaves us with the third option, which is a military option against Iran's economy. Now, Iran, while it is nowhere near the peak that it once was back in the 70s as an oil producer when it was exporting more than 4 million barrels a day, is still in the game. It still exports about 1 million barrels a day, and that income is the primary source of hard currency that the Iranians use to fund everything that they do, from purchasing social stability from their population at home to funding these rocket attacks against U.S. military targets throughout the broader region. And unfortunately for the Iranians, it all flows through a single point called Karg Island, which is on the northeast shore of the Persian Gulf. And it would be very, very, very easy for the United States just to destroy the loading facilities or maybe even the storage tanks and the pumping stations in Karg. They could probably do it with a handful of sorties. It would probably take less than an hour.
Iranian missile defense is not very good. Their air defense is not very good either. And the U.S. obviously is very good at striking in those sorts of conditions, especially when you're talking about something that is on the coast, so you don't have to fly over too many defensive layers to get to it. There'd be a cost to this, of course. Should the United States decide to do this step, it would take the role of the erstwhile global guarantor of maritime security and have the United States taking very discrete shots at very specific parts of the global economy that have relied upon international security in order to function. And that means that any vessels that are part of a long supply chain, a long sail, going through a dangerous area, near a dangerous area, or have multiple supply chain steps, meaning that if you interrupt just one of them, all of them become defunct, all of that would be in danger. And that is the entire electronic supply chain in Southeast Asia and East Asia. That is the entire oil supply chain, which either is sourced from or passes through the Middle East. The consequences of that would be significant on a global basis. But if you want to take the American populist view, which is something that Biden and Trump agree on, is that a lot of that doesn't really matter. And in fact, there's something to be said for stalling those international systems because they favor North American solutions. The United States doesn't get energy from this region anymore. Canada doesn't. Mexico doesn't. So the economies that we care about the most are heavily insulated already. And the economy that we're most dependent upon or the most concerned about is China, and they get all of their energy from this region. Well, not all, but like half. And so if the Biden administration does take this step, things will very much be in motion very quickly. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from St. John's Cathedral in Detroit, which is also a resort because modern Catholicism. Anyway, I thought it would be a great backdrop to talk about the United Kingdom in our Post-America series. The United Kingdom is one of those countries that is not really going to emerge into a post-American world because they've got some really interesting decisions to make, and I'm pretty sure I know how it's going to go. So, backdrop, two things. First, economy. The British system never really adapted to the end of empire. They do all the high value-added stuff, and they import a lot of the raw materials and some of their base manufactured goods, things that they're not very good at because they're good at the really high precision stuff. And when the empire ended and they joined Europe, all they did was kind of switch one empire for another and relied upon the European continent for things like foodstuffs and wood products and automotive. They never made the transition that all the other former imperial powers did. And so when Brexit happened, they found themselves on a bit of a lurch. So that's kind of the economic side of things. On the security side of things, they are an island, and islands are worried about one thing: other countries developing navies that might allow an invasion. So they've always looked at the major powers of the Eurasian landmass with more than just suspicion, outright fear and concern, whether it's Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or whatever, Napoleon, and on and on. But that doesn't mean that they like non-military superpowers. So when folks in the European Union start talking about ever closer union and maybe having a common defense identity, they get a little squeamish and they want to keep things within NATO where they've got veto power. So that's the economic, that's the security. You play that forward to where we are right now, and they're in a bit of a pickle. Demographically, the European Union is on its final legs. Most of the major powers, especially Germany and Italy, are going to be aging into obsolescence within a decade, and most of the remaining countries within 2. And I don't mean to suggest that the UK has a super healthy demography, but it is like the second healthiest within the Union. So when the Brits started talking about Brexit a decade ago, I was like, okay, I can understand the conversation. Getting a jump on what's next, leaving the sinking ship that is the economic aspect of the European Union, that makes some sense. But here we are 7 years after Brexit, and the Brits are still trying to figure out what Brexit means. We still don't have a meaningful policy for how they should go into the new world. And they really only have 2 choices. Option 1, since they haven't done that economic change post-imperial era, is to find a new empire and go out and cut a series of deals with a series of countries that have young demographics that can provide them with raw materials and on and on and on. The problem is they can't do it like they did before. Before, the secret of the British Empire, the reason that they ruled the world for the better part of 2 centuries, is they were in the early days of the industrial era and no one else had caught up. So they were able to use the order of magnitude greater economic intensity of early industrialization and the 3 orders of magnitude better power projection of military technologies to dominate wherever they went with a very small number of people. Well, that's not the world we're in anymore. You can't go into a place like India with 50,000 people and conquer it like you could 2-3 centuries ago. Not to mention that the Indians wouldn't let it happen. So the idea that the Brits as a mid-sized power can be the center of a global trade node, that's a bit of a stretch. I don't want to say it's impossible because weirder things have happened in the last few years, but it's difficult to see enough countries signing on to the idea of British preeminence when the Brits can't force the issue. The second issue is to partner with a singular, large, wealthy country that has better demographic structures and shares the United Kingdom's overall security concerns about United Eurasia as a military power. And the only country that scratches that itch is the United States. Now, it's not like what the Brexiteers said, that they can just waltz into Washington and ask for a free trade deal that is better than what comes from the EU. No. When it comes to trade deals, the United States is very specific, and it doesn't like to bring in systems that could compete with in any meaningful way. And that would mean that the Brits have to accede to American demands on any number of sectors, from agriculture to finance to manufacturing. Hell, we might even make them get rid of the metric system if we're in a bad mood. Now, when the Johnson administration in Britain came over to talk to Donald Trump's administration about a trade deal, and they found out what the conditions would be, they walked away. And then the next government came in and did the same thing and walked away. Or was it Theresa May? Anyway, there were two back to back. And so the Brits right now are in this netherworld where they kind of quietly admit to themselves that in order to find a future that has some degree of economic functionality, they have to get into bed with their kids and accept all the demands. And the hit to their economy will be real, and the hit to their ego will be massive. But the alternative, trying to build an alternate system or maybe going back to the EU, neither of those are long-term solutions that are very functional. So really what we're doing is going through the paces until the Brits admit the obvious. And when that happens, Britain will lose the thing that it values the most, its freedom to act, its agency. It will become a subsidiary of the American system, for better or for worse. And while that will be horrible for the British mindset, it is the best game in town from both an economic and a security point of view, and in time, I have no doubt that that is where the Brits will end up. So, stiff upper lip. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. Now, I get a lot of flack for never having good news, so I figured, here's something fantastic that's happened over the holidays. There's an organization called SunZia, which is a company that produces and transmits electricity, that has closed funding and started construction on what will be the largest green tech power generation system in the hemisphere, 3.5 gigawatts, which in electrical terms is huge. Why does this matter? A bunch of reasons. Number one, $11 billion is how much money they had to raise. Raising money these days is difficult because the baby boomers are majority retired. All of their capital and all their savings has been put into relatively static things like cash and T-bills. And so if you're trying to raise funding for anything, it's gotten a lot more expensive. In addition, unlike if you were to build, say, a natural gas power plant or anything that's fossil fuel-based, with those systems, fossil fuels, only about 1/5 the cost of your full life cycle cost for your facility has to be raised at the front end to pay for construction. But most of it is instead raised from fees when you're generating the power as you go. Instead, with green tech, 2/3 of the cost is up front because there's no fuel cost, but the upfront cost is much higher. So you're talking about 2/3 of the total value of the entire life cycle of the project has to be raised before day one. And so doing that at all is difficult now that capital costs have roughly tripled, but SunZia was able to pull it off. So number one, big achievement for the capital cycle. Number two, the size, 3.5 gigawatts, biggest in the hemisphere. If we are going to do the green transition, we need to increase the amount of power generated in the country by at least 50%. This is a nice little bite taken out of that. But from my point of view, if we're going to deal with the post-China world and expand the industrial plant to manufacture everything we need to expand it by another 50%. So regardless if you're green, if you're pro-development, or both, this takes us a significant step forward. We still need like another 500 of these steps, but we're going in the right direction. Okay, number 3, what it is. It's wind, and it's in New Mexico. So wind, as a rule, is much more cost-effective than solar, in large part because every time the sun goes down, all those solar panels just become paperweights, whereas the wind blows at night. In addition, while we have had incremental improvements in the capacity of photovoltaic cells over the last 15 years, it's nothing compared to what has gone on with wind. It used to be that wind turbines were 100 feet tall. Well, this year, we're going to have prototypes for ones that are 1,000 feet tall. Just massive, massive structures. And they generate more than an order of magnitude more power than the old ones do. And more importantly than their size is their height, because they're reaching wind currents that are far more stable and far stronger. And so we're seeing places in Texas, in Iowa, and now in New Mexico that are using some of these taller turbines to not just generate intermittent power, but baseload power. And that's one of the big problems with green tech. If the wind stops or the sun goes down, you're kind of out of luck and you have to switch to a more conventional system or a battery system, which is much more expensive. But if you are tapping a wind current that never stops, you can use it for baseload and avoid both of those problems. And that's part of the goal here for the SunZia project. But fourth, and I think most importantly, is that unlike almost every green tech project that we have done in the United States to this point, a huge portion of the SunZia project is transmission. They realize that there aren't a lot of people in New Mexico, and Albuquerque can only suck up so much power. And so this project includes massive transmission lines that go into Arizona and link into the network that goes into Los Angeles. And of the 3.5 gigawatts of power generation that they're anticipating, all but 0.5 gigawatt of it is for export to the Arizona and California markets. And the fact that this taps into the LA market is beyond awesome. I don't know how many of you have heard of California, but doing business there is almost impossible. Electricity demand is hardly encouraged, but in many ways, electricity generation is flat out illegal. A very heavy regulatory environment. The state is also very power hungry, and they import about 1/3 of their electricity because they've made it very difficult for producers to operate in their home state. Arizona is by far the single largest supplier they have. And every night when the sun goes down and all those panels that Californians built stop working, 10 gigawatts of fossil fuel power comes from Arizona across the border, flooding into the LA zone. The SunZia project will now be able to put roughly 3 gigawatts of power into that network. It doesn't solve it at a stroke, but it's a much more sustainable program from an environmental point of view than anything that we have right now. So, great step forward. One of the big things that we forget about in the wind and solar is not just the intermittency. It's just that not everybody's place is sunny and not every place is windy, and most people don't live in those locations. So our best wind locations are the Great Plains, from eastern Montana, North Dakota, going down to the panhandle of Texas and West Texas. Our best solar zone is from Southern California going into West Texas as well. New Mexico is on the edge of that Great Plains region. Great wind potential, great solar potential. But there aren't a lot of people in that entire area. You got to wire it somewhere. And this is one of those projects that has managed to work out the details of crossing state boundaries, 2 of them, and getting power to where people actually live in Phoenix and Los Angeles. So we need many, 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 many more of these for this to go. But the fact that we have our first really big one that's already started construction, first power is expected in 2026, it's a great start. Everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from a chilly day in Delray Beach, Florida. Well, chilly for Florida. It's like 50. Today we're going to talk about what's going on in the world of maritime shipping and why we should be thankful that nothing's gone horribly wrong yet and why we shouldn't count on that continuing. Just a quick recap of what's gone down in just the last couple of months. We've got Ukraine taking accurate potshots at Russian energy facilities on the Baltic Sea at a place called Ust-Luga and on the Black Sea at a place called Tuapse. And they're gearing up for an overseas kit now. We've got a drought in Panama, which based on whose numbers you're using and whether you're going by value or tonnage has reduced the throughput of the Panama Canal by somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3. We've got Houthis in Yemen who are taking pot shots at pretty much every other vessel that happens to go by them, which has reduced shipping through the Red Sea by about 10% for energy and cargo. We've got fresh piracy in places like Somalia. It's never really gone away in places like the Gulf of Guinea or the Strait of Malacca. And we've got the Chinese making ever louder noises about wanting to change the security environment in their own neighborhood, even as the Russians are actively making roughly 2/3 of the Black Sea a no-go zone. It's a long list. It's getting longer by the day. But, to this point, there has not been a meaningful break in the old system. A big part of that is because of the insurance structure, where every vessel who's sailing anywhere has to get some sort of policy to insure both their hull and their cargo. And while with the ever-tightening sanctions on the Russians because of the Ukraine war, to this point, that system has not been broken. It has been denied Russian shipping, but Indian, Chinese, and Russian state companies have stepped in to offer policies, and so far, none of the ships that have had problems anywhere have been under one of those policies. So what has happened is we've got this dual system where we have the normal world where the Americans and especially the Europeans are providing the insurance for most of the shipping, when you've got this ghost fleet that's developed, mostly older vessels that were about to be decommissioned, that have been brought back and given a new lease on life as second-rate cargo haulers, especially for liquids, where they have a Chinese, Indian, or Russian insurance policy. This ghost fleet, based on whose numbers you're using, it may be as much as 10% of the global tanker fleet, and there's also a few bulkers and maybe even a few container ships that are kind of joining its ranks now too. Anything that the Russians can do to keep things under the table from the point of view of global record keeping and shipping. Now, what that means is that the risk has been deferred and absorbed by this shadow organization that has kind of popped up. We're now in a situation where we're kind of in a holding pattern, where we're kind of waiting for like a real, actual disruption to happen. Because so far, no real country has targeted any sort of shipping. It's not like the Japanese and the Chinese have started trying to block each other. The U.S. is still using its naval power to patrol the oceans where it can, and the biggest beneficiary of that system is none other than China. And we don't have the Russians or NATO deliberately targeting each other's commercial shipping yet. In fact, everyone is very scrupulously sticking to the old structures. They're just kind of trying to maneuver their own ways to get national and regional advantages. Now, this isn't going to be long for the world. This is a very unstable sort of equilibrium that we have reached in early 2024. And this is crazy. That ghost fleet is the reason why it's all still working. It's kind of a testament to the strategic inertia of the system. But now the buffer, the ghost fleet, is something that is largely documented, largely under the table. And if one of these ships gets into trouble, it's an open question of whether or not the U.S. Navy will step in to help. All of these are unknowns, which means as soon as that happens, a ghost fleet ship gets into trouble or a real country starts taking shots at another country's shipping, we don't just lose that buffer, we lose all of the insulation that we've managed to build up in the last 2 years, and we get a very quick breakdown much faster than we would have otherwise. Now, based on what happens geopolitically, this could all go any number of directions. If the United States decides to take a shot at what the Iranians are doing in the Gulf, that obviously takes us one direction. The Chinese decide to do something in the South China Sea, that takes us another. If Ukraine accidentally hits an actual third-party vessel in some of its anti-Russian operations, it goes another. If the Russians board and capture somebody going to a Ukrainian fort, that takes another. We're on the edge. There's a lot of guns aimed at our heads right now. And it honestly, from my normal point of view, it doesn't really matter which way this goes. It all leads to the same end place, where long-range shipping is simply no longer viable. And shipping in general through dangerous areas is simply no longer viable. And the two biggest plays in the world that benefit from the current system are, ironically, Russian sanctions busting oil exports, which have to sail all the way around Eurasia, and Chinese merchandise exports who have to do the same thing. Those are the longest haul plays out there, all going through dangerous zones. So when this cracks, we see those two things get hurt first, but they will be far from alone. Remember, East Asia is home to half of all manufacturing supply chain steps. There is no version of manufacturing in the world, especially when it comes to things like computing and electronics, where it works without that setup. And that requires global shipping to be safe. So we need to be prepared for the not too distant future when all of this just stops working. And we have to figure out a fundamentally new model that's probably going to be more based on regional trade rather than global. Okay, that's plenty for the day. Take care. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado, where we're about to get another 6 inches of snow. A lot of you have written in about the Biden administration's decision to put an operational pause pending further review on liquefied natural gas exports. There are a lot of people talking a lot of things on all sides. On the energy industry side, they're saying that this is a breach of proper protocol and it's going to really inhibit future investments across the sector. And on the environmentalist side, they're talking about how this is the end of that sector altogether, and they're dancing and singing Kumbaya. Everybody's wrong. Let me kind of lay out what this stuff is. So natural gas is normally transported by pipe because it's difficult to move, it's difficult to store, it's difficult to produce. And so you'll have a pipe network like in North America that is separate from the pipe network in Europe, which is separate from the pipe network in China. Those are the three big ones. You got some smaller ones around the world. They don't connect, or they can't connect. And so if you want to link these together, what you need to do is have a facility on a coast that will chill the stuff down to something like negative 300 degrees or so. And then it's a liquid, and then you put it into a specially designed tanker that can handle these cryogenic fluids. And then you transport it across the ocean to another facility where it unloads and is regasified and then put into the new system. Now, we've been doing this for a few decades, but it's only in the last 15 years that it's really started to become big. And the primary reason for that is the environmental movement, because natural gas, if it's properly burned in an appropriate facility, a combined cycle natural gas plant, generates about half of the CO2 emissions of, say, a coal plant. Also, you can spin up a natural gas facility in just a few minutes, as opposed to a coal facility, which can take hours to even days. And so if you want to pair it with, say, wind and solar, it's the perfect complement fuel, because when the sun goes down or when the wind stops, you can just turn this thing on. And so if you want to get the full capacity from your wind and your solars, you really have to have a conventional system that's dispatchable like natural gas. Now, the United States currently has enough capacity, nameplate capacity, to chill and ship about 13 billion cubic feet of this stuff per day, which makes it the largest exporter in the world already. And under construction are facilities that would allow another 12 BCF per day, which, if you remove the United States' existing capacity from that, that's again the world's largest. And then there's already been stuff permitted for another 16 billion cubic feet per day. So, you add those three together and, where we are right now, that's enough to supply all of Japan. If we bring all of these online, that's almost enough to supply all of Europe. And the Biden freeze doesn't touch any of that. It is a pause of the review process for new facilities. Now, if the United States were to bring these all online, so 13 today, 12 in the few years, and down the road, maybe another 16. You're talking, 40? Yeah, it's more than 40 BCF. And that would be roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of total U.S. consumption of natural gas. If we did get the number that high, we'd have a lot more price linkage between the U.S. market and everywhere else. Remember, natural gas is pretty much sequestered, and LNG has traditionally just kind of played at the margins. But if we had this kind of volume, then Americans would start to be exposed to global natural gas prices. If that were to happen, instead of this $2 to $5 range that we've kind of become used to and is probably going to be our norm for the next few decades, we'd probably see prices regularly going above 15 or 20 as we have international price shocks because of things like, the Ukraine war, or something blowing up in the Middle East. When you only have about 10% exposure, or in our cases a little bit, 10%? Yeah, we got about 10% exposure. The price swings are very muted. And so back in 2021, when the Ukraine war was hot and heavy and we thought we were going to lose all the Russian gas at the same time, the Europeans were dealing with natural gas prices that were well over 70 for a few months, and it was pretty ugly for their industrial stuff. Anyway, let's talk about what people are talking about with this. On the industry side, the idea that we're going to build out past 40 is kind of a stretch anyway, so the oil companies are just whinging because someone's telling them that they can't do anything right now. Second, the Biden administration has not oversold this. They're saying it's a temporary pause of the review process to consider climate change. Well, if you want to consider climate change, natural gas is the perfect fuel to ship out in bulk because it's the only thing that really pairs with solar or wind. You're not going to do this with coal. That would be silly. And batteries sound great until you realize the industrial process that's required to build them at scale is never going to make them more than a niche use in specific areas. I'm not saying there's no use for them there, but natural gas is so much easier. It's so much cheaper. And by most measures, it's actually a lot cleaner too. So you're only going to put batteries in places like Phoenix maybe, where the solar intensity can be really, really high, and they just need to save some, for nights. And then on the environmental side, the celebrations, number one, this is not forever. It's a temporary pause of the review process, which the Biden administration can reverse with a stroke of a pen, or any additional leader could for reasons environmental, economic, or strategic. Remember that a lot of the stuff that's getting shipped out right now is going to Europe in order to allow the Europeans an option other than sucking down Russian gas. So, this is kind of important from that front too. So everyone's kind of making a really big deal out of it, but I think the thing that is most hilarious is that the Biden administration has found a way, again, to satisfy the environmental activists without actually changing the system. This is very similar to what he did when he came into the presidency and he put a moratorium on fracking on federal lands, and everyone was all wailing and gnashing their teeth on one side and screaming bloody delight on the other side. Well, people forget that 99% of all shale operations are on private land, and that is regulated by the states. So it was less than 1% of wells that were affected at all. But it made the environmentalists happy, and it pissed off the energy industry, but it didn't really change anything at all. And Biden is never going to be the preferred candidate of the energy industry, and he was able to placate some of his more hardcore supporters. He's now done that again. So it's a fairly savvy political move that actually moves the needle not at all, which, is one of the smarter things you can say about politics these days.